And welcome to Meet the Writers. I'm Georgina Godwin. In the hopeful chaos after the fall of the Soviet Union, a new generation of Russian journalists emerged, curious, principled, and determined to hold power to account. Among them were two young reporters who began digging into the dark, secretive world of the Kremlin's security services. Their investigations grew into agentura.ru, a pioneering independent website exposing the FSB and the rise of surveillance in modern Russia. Together, they've written a string of acclaimed books, including The New Nobility, The Red Web and The Compatriots, astonishingly all published in Russia at the time, even as they pulled back the curtain on Putin's consolidation of power. That window has since slammed shut. Now, living in exile in London, their latest book is their most personal yet. Our Dear Friends in Moscow tells the story of a generation divided by politics, of trust broken, truth manipulated, and friendships lost. Andrei Soldatov and Irina Borogan, welcome to Meet the Writers.
Thank you.
Hi, hello. Thank you very much for having us here.
It's such an honour to have you in the studio. I've been so impressed by this book, by your story, everything that you have given up and everything that you stick to your principles to fight for. And I really do feel privileged to have you here to speak to you. And I'm really, really excited to find out more about the journey. So I wonder if we could perhaps start with you telling us what it was like growing up in Russia at that time and how that world shaped your interest in journalism, Irina.
Back then, that's about our generation. Back then, that was brilliant because we are children of Gorbachev's perestroika. And what all bad things which happened, they happened with our parents, with our grandparents, and we were the first happy generation, as I always say, in the 20th century, the first happy generation. And there were a lot of promises from the authorities, from the history, from people who surrounded us for our future. So that's why who we are, because we were given freedom for free. We didn't pay for it. Gorbachev came to power and he said, people, you are free now. You can tell everything. You can tell the truth. You have a right to know your terrible history, and you don't oblige to live on the order of the Communist Party anymore.
And how about you, Andrei?
Well, it was basically the same. My granddad was with the military, and of course he was very emotional about perestroika, but because I have a doctor in my family and a nuclear physicist, all these big events which took place in the middle and the late of 1980s, for instance, Chernobyl, felt very personal because the institute where my father used to work took part in trying to mitigate the problems of Chernobyl. So that's why it felt so personal. And also, of course, to be honest, when I was like a kid, I understood that I didn't have a chance to become a journalist. But all of a sudden, with perestroika and with the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, immediately you understand that actually you have this chance. Now there are no control, there are no limits for you to get into the most interesting profession, and I still believe in that.
Yeah, one of the most interesting but lowly paid professions.
That's very true.
You guys have been together for years. How did you meet?
In a newspaper, actually.
Yeah.
And Irina was, to be honest, it sounds a bit melodramatic, but a friend of mine, we started together. He told me at some point, look, I can get you into this newspaper. Maybe you can find a place there. And he brought me with him, and he asked me to wait in his office for some time to the editor to come. And there was this girl with a really bright orange T-shirt, and which spoke with a very authoritative voice. And I immediately took her as a professional and a veteran of his place, and that was Irina. And actually, she joined the newspaper just 3 months before me, but already made this impression.
Compared to you, I was a veteran.
Yes, that's very true.
What the book does is it charts, because you worked at many different news organisations, and we get introduced to the people that you meet along the way. And what you're also doing alongside that, or kind of the stories sort of told in parallel, is writing other books. So The New Nobility, The Red Web, they laid bare how the FSB evolved from the old KGB. Your interest was always in kind of unpacking the security services and what it was. How were you able to publish them in Russia at the time?
To be honest, it was not really possible.
That wasn't easy. That was a crazy way, because we didn't have a possibility to write our books in Russian and publish it in Russian, because to that point in 2010 we were out of job and there were no job ahead. We couldn't be hired by any media in Russia, and we understood that. But we were fortunate that a friend of ours, she offered us to write a book, and to write a book in English, which was absolutely crazy for us back then, because we never lived abroad. We have never been studied in any university on the West. So we lived in Russia, we wrote in Russian, and our English was not perfect back then, but there were no way back, so we could not say no. And she also, and other people, other journalists, they helped us to find a publisher. And that's how it happened. And we wrote a book in English. It was edited by a brilliant editor, David Hoffman, who is a brilliant journalist for the Washington Post and spent a lot of time in Russia. And the book was published in 2010 in English.
In the United States.
In the United States. And only after that, a year passed, and one Russian publisher showed its interest to the book because the book was popular. And they made a translation. We rewrite the translation, and literally word by word. And that's how it was published in Russia. In this case, what is important that the Russian publisher does not have responsibility for the content. All responsibility is on the American publisher.
Which was important back then.
It was a long way back to the Russian public.
That's so interesting. So there was definitely a way to do it. So throughout your journalism career within Russia, you were on the front line of major events, Beslan, the Kursk disaster. I wonder what those moments revealed to you about how the Kremlin controls information.
Well, from the day one when Putin came to power, he made it very clear that the media was the main battlefield for him. For instance, probably our audience remember that when Putin came to power, he immediately started the Second Chechen War, which was a disastrous war which Russia held in the region of Chechnya. And he needed to explain to the Russian people why his war would be better than the one held by and conducted by his predecessor, Boris Yeltsin. And the first Chechen war was lost by Russia. So he needed to explain why he would be able to win his war. And he immediately said that, look, the first war was lost because of journalists, because they undermined our war efforts. All these journalists, Russian and foreign journalists, they were people bribed or corrupted by Chechen terrorists. This time it would be different. And he started a really huge attack on journalists. It was really difficult to cover the war. And of course, when we got all these terrorist attacks in Moscow, specifically in Moscow, Putin attacked journalists for what we did. And we were writing critical stories about the way the Russian intelligence and security services were dealing with this crisis. And he was not happy with that. And that was the very first time when both of us we found ourselves in this Lefortovo prison of the FSB, because the FSB started an investigation against us and they interrogated us. And the way they do interrogations, they interrogate you in a prison, which was not a very comfortable experience, but that was the start. And of course, ever since, it was getting worse and worse.
And yet you describe, all of that's going on. You're being questioned in the prison, but then you're going off to these places where you can just sit, you're smoking on the pavement outside fabulous restaurants. You're just socializing and having fun with all of these like-minded journalists who are slowly beginning to change their tune. Tell me about that.
These people who are characters of our book, they were slightly older than us, 6 years older, and it means when you're 25, it matters.
Yeah.
And they were different from the beginning. We were friends. We understand each other completely. We had a lot of vodka, wine together. We had a lot of conversations until the early hours in the morning. We talked all the time, discussed in Russian style very much. But they, even back then, they felt nostalgic for the Soviet Union, which we never did. We understood completely how happy we were that the Soviet Union collapsed. But they did not. They had a lot of regrets about the lost status of superpower which USSR had back then. They didn't have any regrets about the communist regime. Of course, they were very, very pro-perestroika, but we were different. But anyway, we understand each other completely. They were great people back then.
Why do you think that some of them ended up embracing the regime so much? I mean, for instance, one of them, Petya Akapov, went on to call the final solution to the Ukrainian question. I mean, these are shocking words from people that you were really very close to.
Yeah, and he was a very charming person, and he still is a very charming person. And he was a kind of bookworm. He was obsessed with North Korean stamps and books about China and North Korea. And we believed back then that it was his thing, that he was a bit different. But still, it was possible to talk to him and discuss things. But I believe that several big political crises we had over the last 20 years, for instance, the Moscow protests, which coincided with the Arab Spring in 2011, 2012, that changed a lot. And that changed a lot for the Russian middle classes, and that changed a lot for Petya personally. And that was a moment when he became really aggressive. At some point, he said that Alexei Navalny should be killed, and that would be a way to avoid another bloody revolution like 1917. And that was the point when he reposted a list of the enemies of the state, and our names were on this list. So
and that must have been shocking coming
absolutely.
from
It was just really horrible because we never expected him to attack us personally.
Yeah. You speak of Navalny. Now, you knew him.
Yeah, we met him, of course, because he was you go to some place in Moscow and where you have all liberal journalists hanging around, and of course there you see Navalny and his people.
Yeah, and of course another person you knew was the journalist Anna Politkovskaya. Tell us about her and what that meant for journalists like you when she was killed so shockingly.
We met her at Nova Gazeta, and she was a star, so I can say we were friends. We've never been. And she was the only known name in the world she was the only Russian journalist who was known outside Russia. And we went first to the UK. Our journalist friends showed her book at the bookstore. I don't remember where, at Piccadilly. It was Waterstones on Piccadilly. But she was not very popular among Russian journalists back then because what she was writing about, all this truth about the Chechen Republic, about the war in Chechnya and what's going on with women, children, with civilians there, that was very uncomfortable truth. And not a lot of people, including journalists, were ready to think about that and discuss that things because it was to the point we met her. It happened in 2006. It happened in 2006, 2005. It was Putin proclaimed the war was over, and in Moscow people were very fine with that. They were okay. But Anna Politkovskaya, she wrote that the war has not ended yet. And the terrible things we called Zachystka, which is a terrifying raid in the people's homes in Chechnya, which is very often followed by killings and rapes, still going on. That's why people didn't like her. But the moment when she was killed, she was always in danger. And we understood that, everyone understood that, and she understood that completely. But the moment when we learned that she was killed was an absolute shock because she could be killed many times before and in the war and by her enemies, and it never happened. But when it happened, it just was the final point. I mean, you understood that there is no way back. The Russia will be different since the moment. And Putin's reaction that she was not so important, she was more important abroad than for people here. It was so
cynical, to be honest.
Cynical, and but unfortunately, it reflects the mood among people in Moscow.
Tell us more.
Yeah, unfortunately, and we all back then worked for Novaya Gazeta, and of course we immediately rushed to the office, and all journalists were there. We were talking about who might be, what we're going to do, how we're going to investigate that, because the way journalists react to any crisis is immediately to switch into professional mode, because that's your way to deal with your emotions. And of course we did that, but 3 days later, when there was a day of her funeral, and after the funeral we got to the place where she lived, there was such a small crowd of people, less than 50 people maybe 60. But we knew that at that day in Paris, more people gathered, like hundreds and hundreds of people. And that was so shocking. You understand that you almost completely lost your audience in your country. And that was emotionally difficult.
Because it was the greatest oil prices ever in Russian history, and people getting richer and richer, at least in Moscow. And that's what was in the center of their attention.
The whole kind of oligarch culture, which you go into beautifully in this book. You also write about your father, who was responsible for bringing the internet to Russia.
Yes, he was. As a nuclear scientist, he had this very important for him personally trip to Copenhagen in the 1980s, and he was impressed by, back then it was not yet the internet, it was some local telecommunications network at the University of Niels Bohr, but he was so profoundly fascinated by this idea. So when he got back to the Soviet Union, to his university, he said, look, we need to start doing something like that. We need to establish connection with the West. And that was a moment when the first Russian internet service provider was born. And he launched, basically, he was after that proclaimed the father of the Russian internet. And, well, it was never really easy between us because my parents divorced when I was 8. But we always had these conversations with him about politics, about openness, about many, many things. For instance, at some point, he was, under Putin, he was, actually, when Medvedev was president, he was appointed deputy minister of communications, which came as a big surprise to me because my father forgot to tell me. So I learned about that when a correspondent of some news agency called me and said, look, can you comment that your father was just promoted to the Deputy Minister of Communications? And my father, he was in charge of many initiatives. For instance, at some point, there was a big thing to get Cyrillic on the internet. So you can use Cyrillic to type the internet address. And we had a really big clash. My father was really proud of his achievement, and I was very skeptical. And I said, look, I think it's actually maybe not such a good thing because people would feel more isolated because when you type something in English, you understand that you are part of a bigger world. But if you type everything in your native language, it makes your world smaller. And of course he said, no, you just give people more options, more opportunities. So it was always very emotional, political between us. But yeah.
He ended up in jail.
Yes, precisely because he was the internet pioneer and he built a significant part of the Russian internet infrastructure. Of course, for the Kremlin at some point it became a big political issue because the internet, it's all about digital sovereignty, it's about control of the Russian information space, and everything should be under government control. And my father was never a big fan of such a big control from the government. He believed in the idea of the network, that everything is horizontal, that there is no chief, no leader, no one guy who is in charge of the entire network. And maybe it was not very wise of him, but he said no. And the government started an attack on him, an investigation, accusing him of all kinds of things. At that point, we were still in Moscow. It was 2019. Next year, we left. And this criminal investigation was going on and on and on. And I was thinking at some point, maybe I was too optimistic, that maybe we are just trying to find an excuse to cancel this investigation because it was so obviously so stupid. But unfortunately, last year, they changed their minds and sent his case to the court. And yeah, they decided to imprison him. So he has been in jail since last July.
And he's still there.
Yes.
Just talking about the internet and the effect that it's had, just to look at it more globally, how do you assess Russia's use of technology in the way that influences media and propaganda and elections and all sorts of things in the rest of the world? How much of a threat is Russia to everyone else?
Propaganda is a great thing in Russia, and the USSR and New Russia after Yeltsin, there were the only periods when Russia didn't have propaganda. It was 10 years since, even 8 since 1991 to 2000 when Putin came to power. But all other times Russia had a huge and still have a huge propaganda machine. And in Russia, it's not like Russian people are so stupid and brainwashed by propaganda machine completely, but this propaganda always mix with a fear. And that a poisonous mix. When you are afraid of the authorities, and authorities can do anything to you, you just say a word about the war and you will be sent to prison. You post something on your Facebook or other social media and you will be sent to prison or fined for a huge amount of money. And simultaneously you are listening to the TV channels which all under control by the Kremlin, and they are saying that the Ukrainians are bad, they are Nazis, the war should improve the world, and we didn't start that war, the NATO started this war, and all this bullshit. But when this thing is combined with fear, it's have a ubiquitous effect on you. And that's why people repeat all these things. It's not like they believe all the time in this, but they have to. And they try to suppress their, independent mind in order to follow the Kremlin's path, in order to survive.
And internationally, the propaganda is always about responding to what people already think in their societies. Unfortunately, the problem with the Kremlin's narrative is they do not create these narratives from scratch. They're trying to identify the real problems, like migrants or grievances, for instance. It's very different for Eastern Europe or Western Europe. In Eastern Europe, of course, the Kremlin propaganda always trying to play on the failed expectations of the populations of these countries. All of us, in Eastern Europe, were promised prosperity after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and some countries it worked to some extent, and some countries it didn't work. So but because we were given back then in the 1980s and 1990s this idea that just in 2 years you would be living like in France or in Germany, and of course the reality was slightly different. You can always play on these feelings, of this feeling that you actually were cheated and it was a betrayal and the West just used you and exploited you. And again, the history of the Second World War. Again, it's very important because...
It's called the Great Patriotic War in Russia.
War. And again, to present it to, for instance, it's different how you present the Russian achievements, for instance, in this war, in the audience of Poland or in France. So the propaganda actually is quite skillful. They know how to talk to different audiences. And of course, the other problem is that there's a lot of, for instance, anti-Americanism in the Western society, and lots of people think that if you support someone like Putin, he is seen by many as some sort of alternative. And of course, look, it's not like Putin wants to really challenge the world order. We all see that despite his criticism of, for instance, of the war in Syria, Russia never did anything to help Syrian refugees. There are no Syrian refugees in Russia. So it's quite astonishing that, on the one hand, the Kremlin always was critical and has been critical of the West and the way the West was dealing with big problems in the world, but they never tried to offer any solutions to these problems, right? So you are critical, but you do not want to take any responsibility. But because sometimes people just want to listen to exactly that, it's enough of them.
And of course, there's been a huge amount of propaganda around the war in Ukraine, or the special operation, as you must call it, in Russia. Tell me, do you think, Irina, that Putin has a long-term plan for Ukraine, or is it all improvisation and fear? He's reacting because things didn't go as he had hoped.
That's true. Things God didn't go according with his plan. But I can't read Putin's mind. But what I see, that the situation is worsened because of what's going on with the United States, and because the United States stopped sending arms and artillery to Ukraine. And I can't see any way out of the war soon. I can't.
What do you think, Andrei?
Yeah, it's very difficult because on the one hand, you see that people in Moscow, and of course we still talk to lots of people in Moscow and some other big cities in Russia, they felt very depressed and they are very tired of this war. And there was a big hope that Trump could change that, and now this hope completely disappeared. But nevertheless, in a country where public opinion doesn't really matter, Putin might go on as it pleases him for a very long time. The other problem is that sometimes these comparisons with the Cold War doesn't really work. For instance, when the Soviet Union was collapsing, yes, the Soviet Union also had this horrible war in Afghanistan, but it was much smaller. And not a lot of people were directly involved in the war in Afghanistan. This time is absolutely different. There are so many people involved. And it means that these people and their families, they feel very proud of themselves. They made a lot of money and they invested in this war. So if you start criticizing the war, it's not only about Putin, it's also about these people. And also these people are getting more and more ambitious politically. They want to have a say in what the country is doing internationally and domestically. So at some point, because lots of people ask us this question, like what's going to happen when Putin is gone? Well, the problem is that we're going to deal with these people, with the veterans of the war in Ukraine. It's about hundreds and thousands of people, a lot of people who are extremely aggressive. They don't want to feel sorry, or they don't want to, I don't know, you can't. It would be really difficult to explain to them what they did and how they should pay for what they did. It would be quite difficult.
Andrei, you are right that this war is a lot of people involved in this war personally. It's personal. This war is very personal for me because my father, he came from Ukraine. He came from Odessa. And all his family, my cousins and my auntie, they all live in Odessa or Odessa region. And on daily basis, or I say on nightly basis, I get news from Odessa, which is very often under bombardment. And I'm very worried about my aunt, who's 87 years old, and she lives in Izmail. And this city is also very, very often attacked by the Russian drones and missiles. And she lives by her own, and she prefers, when the city is under attack, she prefers to spend night out because she's afraid of being buried under the rubble.
I mean, everything has had such a huge personal effect on both of you and, of course, so many other people. Is it worth it? Are you happy you stuck to your principles? I mean, you look at your friends that you write about and they've all gradually changed their opinions. And I wonder if they believe it or they're just being pragmatic.
Well, they believe that they are pragmatic because it's quite interesting that all of them share a very dark view on Russia. They believe that the country could be governed only by a dictator, and that is, to be honest, the primary motivation why they decided to work for Putin, because they believe in a country like Russia, if you want to achieve something, and all of these people are extremely ambitious, you need to work for the dictator. I think why it's different for us, because we always believed in our profession, and because journalism was not invented in Russia, it's a universal thing, or at least we believe in that. To be honest, it's extremely important for us. That is why, even when we left our country, we still believe that we are part of this international community of journalists. And we are very lucky to have friends among journalists here and in the United States and France and Italy and Spain. It's such a great feeling when you feel that you are on the same page with people of your profession, because that gives you focus, that gives you, if you wish, your identity.
I just want to ask one more question about the book specifically, because you describe all your friends there, you describe the political and propaganda journey that they went on, and then you're writing the book and you're getting back in touch with them, these people who have publicly called for your death or really, really disagree with you. How did you persuade them to talk to you, and why write this book now?
We didn't try to persuade them to talk to us. We just asked them, and some of them kindly agreed. And I talked to Petya Akopov, who is a guy who wrote an article calling for the final solution to the Ukrainian questions. And it was because he was my favorite friend out of all the group of friends. And I spent days and nights talking to him and discussing everything. And when I called him, he was very charming, he was very friendly, he was happy to talk to me. And that was emotionally very hard for me, because what I listened to on my phone was the old beautiful voice of old beautiful Petya. And I understand at the same time that he is, this person who called for the final solution to the Ukrainian questions. And I asked him, in the last interview, I asked all this question about Ukraine and my personal experience, my relatives, and his answer was very, very honest. And it put me in a state of shock for many, many hours, because he said that he's very sorry about my family, and he's very sorry about what's going on with people in Ukraine, with civilians. And he said that it is the same. It happened during the Russian Revolution of 1917, and that's personal. There are a lot of personal tragedies, and it's very, very sad. But he made a pause and he said, "But we have to go further. We can't stop." That was the last conversation. I was really shocked. I could not speak after that for several hours.
It's extraordinary. I just want to finish by finding out about exactly what it is that you're doing now. You run this website.
Yes, and we keep doing what we've been doing for 25 years, investigating the activities of the Russian intelligence and security services. We believe it's important. Maybe now it's even more important than it was like 5 years ago, especially because, unfortunately, what we see now is new tactics, a much more aggressive stand. What we see, for instance, never before Soviet before, intelligence agencies attacked Europe with sabotage attacks. And that's exactly what we see now. We see sabotage attacks and assassinations on a completely unprecedented scale. So that's what we do now. We are investigating that.
Are you afraid?
We live under police protection here, but we believe that in London is relatively more safe than, say, on the continent. So you always need to be, you cannot, because if you want to keep doing what you are doing, you still need to talk to people, meet people, and of course you understand that might involve some risks, but it's what you do. You just need to try to calculate that.
My answer to this question is, once I was asked by a guy at some party, "Irina, do you live in a fear?" And I said, "No, I live in London."
Irina, Andrei, thank you both very much. That's Andrei Soldatov and Irina Borogan. And their book is Our Dear Friends in Moscow, The Inside Story of a Broken Generation. It's published by Public Affairs. It's out now. They also run the website agentura.ru. You've been listening to Meet the Writers, thanks to the production team of Steph Chungu and Mariella Bevan. And you can download this show and previous episodes from our website or wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Georgina Godwin. Thank you for listening.